Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Beethoven's most embarrassing work. Yeah, I'll bet you thought it couldn't be done. And some of you sort of did the obvious. You said, oh, well, it's got to be Wellington's Victory, or how are you going to find something besides Wellington's Victory? It's actually not difficult at all. It really isn't. First of all, let's talk about Wellington's Victory for a minute. I made a whole video about it. You should go watch it. But Wellington's Victory is a good piece of its type. It really is. Beethoven took great pains over it. I read the whole preface to Wellington's Victory. He was very detailed in what he wanted to do. And he had no intention of overestimating its value. He really didn't. He knew it was an occasional work, a potboiler, a piece of populist art, and that's okay. He didn't have a problem with that. He had a problem with people who trashed it for claiming it wasn't, it wasn't as exalted as the late string quartets. I mean, they hadn't been written yet, but you know what I mean. It wasn't an exalted piece of sublimity when it so obviously wasn't. You know, a bad piece of music is something that pretends to be something other than what it is. Music which is dishonest. And nothing can be more honest than Wellington's Victory. I mean, it just gets up there, has some great tunes, it makes a lot of noise, and then it has a big rousing ending. And what could be bad about that? So you're wrong. Beethoven's most embarrassing work is not Wellington's Victory. Something is embarrassing when it pretends to be something that it's not. When it doesn't fulfill the expectations that it arouses. When it lavishes fine music on something utterly ridiculous and unworthy. And utterly ridiculous and unworthy, again, we have to be careful. It doesn't necessarily mean a stupid plot. Most things have stupid plots by our own definition of what, smart plots are boring. Stupid plots are fun. So, we have to be really careful in how we determine what we think is embarrassing. So you may want to know, what is Beethoven's most embarrassing work? Well, it's easy. It's the Overture to the Ruins of Athens. I mean, plain and simple. It's one of Beethoven's shortest overtures. It's like 4.5 minutes long. It is formally dysfunctional. That's why it's his most embarrassing work, because Beethoven was nothing if not a formal genius. And when he goes, he expanded he created the tradition on the one hand, but he created the tradition by bursting the bounds of what the prior tradition had been. And when he goes outside of the box, usually we're willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. We really are. The late quartets, the late piano sonatas, all kinds of interesting forms, and the contrast between contrapuntal forms and dramatic sonata forms and things that he was interested in his late period. We give him total credit for being a genius when it came to his handling of form. And his compatriots thought that he was out of his mind. They thought that his music was as good as formless, especially the late stuff, which is incomprehensible to his contemporaries. But history has given him a pass on that, and now we look at it and say, it's genius. And this is one of the anomalies in any kind of art criticism, aesthetic criticism, with its inherent subjectivities, because you look at one thing and you say, well, Bruckner, for example, was helpless in writing pieces in normal sonata form. Then you look at it a different way and say, okay, he thought he was writing in sonata form, but he was really doing something else. And that something else he did really quite well. And his genius lies in the way his music avoids writing in sonata form. Well, it's the same music, and people are citing the same basic facts and drawing completely opposite conclusions as to their value. That happens. So it's difficult to find pieces that are really worthy of being embarrassed at. But Beethoven's Ruins of Athens Overture is one of them. And the reason it is because he was under a lot of pressure. I mean, he wrote it very hastily. We all know this. He probably didn't care very much about it. The incidental music and other stuff that he wrote around it has some really wonderful tunes and fabulous moments. The story is crazy. It's an allegorical story about, the ruins of Athens. It's the ashes of Vienna rising from, the whatever. And it doesn't make any difference what it is. It won't make any sense to us today, and we certainly wouldn't care. So, but that's not why The Ruins of Athens is bad and embarrassing. The reason it's embarrassing is because Beethoven almost never failed when he explored new forms or did something innovative. I mean, he could create things that were like nothing else anyone had ever done, like the Consecration of the House Overture, which is magnificent and completely sui generis. There is nothing else like it in all of orchestral music. But The Ruins of Athens is embarrassing because it is a formal mess. How is it a formal mess? Well, it starts with an introduction. The introduction's got a couple nice tunes, which come back later as vocal works in the incidental music. That's fine. And then you have a first subject, a sort of scurrying violin-y first subject, which has no distinctive personality at all. And then a more attractive second subject over pizzicato strings or something like that, if I recall correctly. I mean, it's nice. It's nice. Most theatrical overtures have minimal to no development sections. That's how we know that they're theatrical overtures. They're either very, very short or they go immediately back to the recapitulation. And so this piece does that. It goes to the recapitulation, and you hear the first subject, and then it ends. And that's it. There's no second subject. There is no coda. As a result of that, the piece sounds terribly truncated. And it all depends on how your feeling of form is, how you understand these things are supposed to work. But it would not surprise me if you listen to this a few times and begin to realize there's something missing. What's missing is the rest of the overture. It just stops after the recapitulation of the first subject. That makes the form unbalanced. And again, this is one of those things where you're only going to know that if you know what balanced form is. But if you do know what balanced form is, then you know something is amiss. And in this case, not knowing that something is amiss is no excuse. You can't just turn around and say, oh, well, Beethoven was a genius for leaving out the second subject and leaving out the coda. No, he wasn't. He was in a rush, is what he was. And the result is one of the very, very few formally dysfunctional, defective works in his output. Maybe the only one. I don't know, because even where he's not being formally, innovative, like in the Triple Concerto, which consists entirely of formulaic constructs, at least in the first movement, he's following established procedure and doing it quite effectively. But here, it just seems as if it was a rush job that he allowed to get away from him. And for that reason, I suspect that if he were still around and we said, hey, Ludwig, what do you think of the Ruins of Athens Overture? And he would say, oh, gosh, I'm so embarrassed. It should never be played separately. It's just a little theatrical prelude. He would be making excuses. He'd be on the defensive, and rightly so, because there's a lot to be on the defensive about in this little snippet of middle period Beethoven. So that, my friends, is Beethoven's most embarrassing work. And, at least by the criteria that I think I established for what constitutes an embarrassing work of Beethoven, this one certainly fills the bill, because it basically gives up. It gives up. It quits in the one area in which Beethoven can 99.99999% of the time be counted on to be an absolute genius and master and visionary, even in his least interesting throwaway works. Here, all we get is the throwaway. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.